Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Crypt13 and welcome to the first part of my Xiao guide. In this one, we're gonna go over his skills, talk about his damage output at free-to-play levels, go over some calculations, and give you guys some of his most damaging combo rotations. There will be no artifacts, weapons, or team comps today because this video is already pretty long. Stay tuned for part 2 where I will go over that stuff. Alright, let's get started. Alright, let's quickly go over his skills. His first talent is his normal and charged attacks. His normal attack is nothing really extraordinary. It's got decent scaling, and it's got some 2-hit combos with the first hit and the 4th hit. His charged attack launches his opponents into the air instead of away, and this is actually a good combo tool with good scaling. His E skill is a forward lunge that deals damage to all enemies within its path, and it starts with 2 charges and has a 10-second cooldown on each charge. This may seem like a simple move on the surface, but it's actually quite intricate, and I've reserved an entire section for it later on in the video. His Q skill or his burst doesn't do damage. You can think of this as a stance change. What this does is that he gets a large damage bonus for his normal attack, charge attack, and plunged attacks. His E skill does not receive this bonus, and his attacks become infused with animo damage, and they also gain a little bit more AoE. While in this mode, his E skill does not generate particles, which is very important. His life will also begin to drain at 3% of his current HP every second. Then as you level up this talent, it goes down to 2.5% and 2%. He also starts to jump really high, which allows him to utilize plunge attacks very effectively. Next are his passive talents. The first one relates to his ultimate skill and gives him damage bonus for everything. It will initially increase his damage by 5%, and then every 3 seconds, it will increase by another 5% up to a maximum of 25%. His Ascension Phase 4 passive talent relates to his E skill, and what this does is that it gives his E skill 15% extra damage in the form of a stack that lasts 7 seconds with a maximum of 3 stacks. Gaining a new stack will refresh the stack's duration. These stacks do not exist independent of each other, so what this means is that once 7 seconds is over, you are going to lose all of your stacks. Xiao kind of has 2 playstyles, whether you want to keep him on the field at all times or if you want to use him purely for his burst. So if you prefer to play Xiao only for his burst, which means you're not actually a true Xiao main, then what you want to do is use your elemental skill right away so you can generate your elemental particles as quickly as you can. Then you swap off to your other characters for about 20 seconds and have Xiao passively gain energy while he's sitting in the back. Once Xiao's E skill charges come back up, you can swap back to him, pop both of them, and then your ult should be up by that time. His other play style is if you are a true Xiao main and you want to leave him on the field as much as you can. With this style, you have to space out your E skills in certain intervals so that you can make sure to hit the max amount of stacks and get maximum damage out of this skill. After all, this skill is the most damaging part of his kit, so making sure that you're using this skill to its maximum potential is definitely something you want to keep in mind. And again, I've reserved how to do this in the E skills section later on in the video. And then of course, if you play Xiao with another animal support, which I definitely recommend, then you would play him the same way with both styles, but you want to make sure he directly absorbs the particles that the animal support character creates. And if you're playing Xiao in the main DPS slot, and then when you swap him in, and he's got both of his elemental skill charges, and he's really close to getting his burst, then don't worry about spacing out your elemental skills, just pop both of them to get into your burst, because your burst is where you deal your true damage. Xiao has no ability to support. He can really only fill DPS roles, so there's really no getting around that. Alright, now let's start talking about his E skill. If you hit an enemy with your E skill, you're going to generate 3 particles. His E skill also has the ability to disable Ruin Guards. You just need to make sure that you time it correctly. When the Ruin Guard does attacks, that lowers his weak spot down a little bit lower. His E skill also does not have any iframes on it. The stacks that come with his passive is impossible to maintain 100% uptime with your 2 charges. You can reach 3 stacks, but it requires incredibly precise timing. You have to use your skills just before the 7-second timer is up. If you can keep an eye on your elemental skill timer, you can hit 3 stacks pretty reliably. So here's how you do it. When you start with 2 charges, you use your skill and you'll get 1 stack. You use your skill again right before it hits 3 seconds, and this will give you 2 stacks. Then you'll want to use your skill again once your elemental skill hits about 6.2 or 6.3 seconds till charged, just to be safe. This is going to give you 3 stacks. Then to capitalize on the 3 stack damage, you'll want to use your skill as soon as it comes off cooldown. And then once you do this, all of your stacks will go away after 7 seconds. seconds since you have used all of your charges. So if you're not really paying attention to your E skill, then the best that you'll probably get naturally is probably the damage with just one stack. If you're really not paying attention at all, then you're not going to be getting any benefit from his passive. Unless of course you're just double spamming both charges right away. Then you'll always be hitting the one stack damage. Then we have to talk about how to cancel this move because it's really weird. You can't jump cancel this move like normal attacks, and the dash cancel is kind of slow. The best way to cancel this move is to attack. And then once you attack, you can input your dash or your jump immediately after. And so one thing that is important to know that I mentioned earlier is that your E skill is not affected by the damage bonus of your burst. So this means, should we use our E skill for damage or should we use it for energy? This question is quite difficult to answer, so instead just go with what you think sounds better out of the options that I'm going to tell you. If you want to use it for energy generation, then you'll typically only be getting 1 stack's worth of damage on his E skill, since you are going to use both of his charges right away. If you have both of your charges and your burst is available, then what you'll want to do is pop both of those charges and then pop your burst right away. That way he will gain the energy while he's in his burst. And then that leaves his entire skill on cooldown, and by the time that your burst is over, both of your charges will be back up. And then while in his burst mode, don't use your E skill since you won't be generating any particles. Because in the middle of your burst, you'll have at least recharge one of your charges. Popping both of the skills immediately is definitely the playstyle you want to go for if you're playing Xiao as a sub DPS and not keeping him on the field for as long as you can. Now if we want to use it for damage, managing stacks can take quite a lot of effort, so it might not be for everybody. Like I said before, it is impossible to maintain 100% uptime at C0, and the best that you'll get is probably 2, maybe 3 if you're perfect with your stack management. But if you're going to be using Xiao as a main DPS and keeping him on the field as much as possible, then I would recommend practicing this cycle to get the most damage out of his E skill. So then that means you're also getting the most damage when he's not in his burst mode. And then the one thing to remember if you're playing Xiao in the main DPS role is that make sure you don't have any elemental skill charges when you go into your burst. Because you don't generate any elemental particles, you want to leave as much of the cooldown on your elemental skill during your burst as much as possible. Now let's go over his damage and some calculations. All of the calculations are done using plus 16 artifacts with no substats taking into account. He is Ascension Phase 5, level 70 with level 8 talents, as well as a level 90 maxed weapon. This is going to give us a good baseline for Xiao at free-to-play levels with cheap investment. The artifacts that he is holding is attack percent sands, animo damage goblet, and a crit damage circlet. And so if we look at his numbers, he's actually got pretty good numbers while in his burst. His plunging attack is his strongest move while in his burst mode, so we can use this to compare him to other characters. Do note that with the Black Cliff pole, I am stacking crit damage with the circlet, when perhaps maybe you should run a crit rate circlet instead if you don't have enough crit rate substats. This might explain why the deathmatch looks like it's underperforming over the Black Cliff pole. If you have the crit rate substats to get a Black Cliff build up to around 60 to 75% crit rate, and you use these same substats on a deathmatch build, you'll end up with ridiculous amounts of crit rate, since you get about 36.8% with it, but you'll have lower crit damage. So ultimately, it's gonna come down to which you prefer. Do you want to let RNG take the wheel and deal higher crit damage with the Black Cliff build, or do you want consistency with lower crit damage with a deathmatch build? This of course is assuming that we are working with the exact same amount of substats between each build. So what this means is that if you have a lot of crit rate from substats to reach pretty high levels, then go for a Black Cliff build, and then vice versa for a deathmatch build. If you have lots of crit damage substats, then go with the deathmatch, and let the weapon take care of the crit rate. And since these calcs were done without taking into account any kind of substats, these numbers that we're seeing is definitely going to be lower than what you're going to be seeing in game, as your artifact substats will definitely have flat attack, attack percent, and extra crit. So we've kind of established that he's got pretty decent numbers, but how does he compare to the likes of Ganyu and Diluc? So if we compare this Xiao build with a similar build build for Ganyu and Diluc, where we would obviously swap out the goblet for a cryo damage goblet or a pyro damage goblet, the result is that he actually does damage that's really close to them. But if we're just looking at pure numbers, it's not really going to tell us the whole story, because we need to know the speed in which they dish out this damage. In other words, we need to know their frame data. So let's go ahead and jump into that section now. So Xiao's frame data kind of varies pretty wildly. But let's start with some of his more consistent frame data, his full 6-hit normal attack string, and his 1-hit into charged attack string. So his 6-hit normal combo string comes out to be about 220 frames, which maths out to be about 3.67 seconds. This is measured to the first frame he is able to input another attack or start walking. You can cut these frames down with either a dash or a jump. His 1 charged string takes about 1.3 seconds or 78 frames. And this is also again when Xiao is able to input another attack or is able to start walking. And just like his 6-hit combo string, you can cut the frames on this by either dashing or jumping as soon as you hit an enemy. So his plunge attack frame data is going to vary. And this is because this will depend on when you cancel your jump with the plunge attack. You can cancel your jump animation pretty quickly after jumping. The best I was able to get is about 3 frames into the jump animation and then initiating a plunge attack. There is such a huge window in which you can actually input your plunge attack to cancel your jump animation. You can try to do it as fast as you can, or you might accidentally mess up the timing and then you're going to be at the peak of your jump and then initiate the plunge damage. So obviously the higher you are, the slower your plunge attack animation is going to be. So we want to be as low as possible in order to get the best frame data out of this. The frame data for this is also going to be affected by when you cancel your auto attack with a jump. If you haven't seen my video on how charged attack canceling work, I recommend you watch that video. I will leave a link to that video in the description below. But basically, in order to get the fastest plunge attacks, you want to cancel the plunge attack landing animation with an auto attack. So if you're able to perfectly cancel your auto attacks with a jump, then you're going to be saving frames on your plunge attack. So obviously there's no way you can get this down frame perfect, so you don't really need to worry too much about it. The important thing to know is that you just want to try to initiate your plunge damage as fast as you can from your jump. And so the average amount of frames that I've gotten for plunge attack animation is somewhere between about 65 frames and 80 frames, anywhere between that. This translates to about 1.08 seconds to about 1.3 seconds. So it's pretty safe to say that from the moment he jumps and the moment he lands and is able to input another attack takes about 1.2 seconds to 1.5 seconds. So in my opinion, that's pretty fast. He's got pretty decent frame data if you're able to utilize all of the animation cancels properly. Now I do also have to mention that if you do cancel your jump with a plunge attack as fast as you can, you'll be getting the low damage AoE of your plunge attack. Whereas if you let the jump fly, you'll get the high damage portion of your plunge attack. And of course you can definitely get the high damage plunge attack in the middle, but it's really hard to find that sweet spot. Either you're letting the jump just go all the way up, or you're just canceling it right away. So let's just keep this in mind when we talk about his DPS. Now let's talk about his combos and his rotations. Some of his best combos and rotations is going to be doing a 1-hit into charged attack into plunge attack, a 1-2 charged attack into plunge attack, or a 1-2-3 auto attack into charged attack into plunge attack. So use whichever combo is best suited for the situation at hand. Xiao also has a unique combo when he's not in his burst, and this combo is to do his charge attack into a jump, into an E skill, into a plunge attack. This unique combo is a good amount of burst damage when he is not ulting, but it can sometimes whiff on enemies if you don't execute the combo correctly. The most consistent way I've gotten this to hit is to make sure to use your E skill close to the ground. This means to jump, wait half a second, and then use your E skill into a plunging attack. It might take some practice to get down. There are also a couple more things that I need to mention about his plunging attack rotation, and it's that his normal attack has really terrible range, and the first hit whiffs a lot. So that means you're missing out on about 40% scaling because you whiff the first part of your first auto attack. And damage is damage, so it really sucks that the range on this is so terrible. And another thing about his plunging attacks is that they are so inconsistent. They have terrible hitboxes. hitboxes. So very rarely are you going to actually be hitting enemies with the actual plunging attack. You're mostly only going to be hitting with the AoE. And this really sucks because the scaling on the actual plunge attack is pretty high. So we're missing out on a decent amount of damage because we can't really hit enemies with the actual plunging attack very consistently. I mean, in this clip here, I am literally on top of this Ruin Guard and I am not getting both plunge attack hits. But then I found better consistency when I wrapped around to his backside, as seen in the clip here. Perhaps disabled Ruin Guards just might have wonky hitboxes, because when I go against a Ruin Hunter, I'm actually hitting the plunging attack much more consistently. And so against non-moving single targets, Xiao can actually get a lot of damage by getting damage from both of his plunging attacks. So what I'm saying here is that it's not impossible to hit with both plunging moves, I'm just saying it's wildly inconsistent and matchup dependent. And so here are my thoughts on his overall damage comparison. While considering his frame data, Xiao has the potential to do more damage than Ganyu and Diluc while in his burst if we compare only Ganyu's charge shot and Diluc's searing onslaught combo. Diluc is dealing about 20,000 damage every 7 seconds, Ganyu deals about 73,000 damage every 10 seconds, and Xiao can deal about 76,000 damage every 10 seconds. This assumes that every hit in your combo will deal a critical hit, so that means Diluc kind of has the short end of a stick here because he has a lot of hits in his combo, whereas Ganyu is only doing 2 hits and then Xiao is doing 3 hits, with his 1 auto combo into charge attack into plunge attack combo. This is also only single target damage, so if we think about AoE damage, Xiao can do even more. Ganyu and Xiao have similar AoE, but Diluc's AoE is more limited with his normal attack and searing onslaught. You can still hit multiple enemies with it, but it's not as big as Ganyu's and Xiao's. When you add Ganyu and Diluc's bursts into the mix, then they start doing more damage. Since Xiao's frame data varies so wildly, what this means is that on a more consistent basis, Xiao is going to be doing either the same amount of damage or slightly lower damage than both Ganyu and Diluc. This damage also only comes from his burst. When he's not in his burst, his damage is actually quite lackluster. His E skill is his highest scaling attack while not in his burst, but it's not enough to match the damage of Ganyu or Diluc. We also have to take into account that Ganyu and Diluc can take advantage of Melt or Vaporize, which increases their damage by a lot. And so if we take that into account, Diluc and Ganyu deal more damage than Xiao. Xiao, however, does get swirl damage, but it's not enough, and it scales with your character's level, meaning to get the max damage out of swirl, we have to use way too many resources than it's actually worth. So this is the end of the video, but make sure to check out part 2 where I will go over his artifact builds, weapons, team comps, and some more specific matchup information. But anyways, hopefully this video helps you guys get a better understanding of Xiao's damage and how to maximize it, especially for his E skill. And at the end of this Xiao guide series, I'll give you guys my final thoughts on him. But until next time, see you later.